Imagine, if you will, a world where the ordinary becomes the extraordinary, where every corner lies with mystery and each shadow dances with untold stories. Here, time bends and reality blends with fantasy. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls of all ages, welcome to the Emporium of Imagination.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, The Count, and this evening I will be reading to you Episode 5 of Alexander's Greatest Adventures. As Alexander wandered down one of the McAllister's estate's dimly lit hallways, he paused when he heard voices drifting from a nearby office. The door was slightly ajar, and he couldn't help but overhear James' familiar tone, though it was laced with a seriousness Alexander hadn't heard before. "The task needs finishing," James said, his voice clipped, as if it weighed with something unspoken. Another voice, low and gravelly, responded, but Alexander couldn't make out the words. The voice was unfamiliar, its rough tone hinting at authority, and something about it sent a shiver down Alexander's spine. Whoever this was, they weren't like the polished guests or servants he'd seen around the estate. Alexander's curiosity got the better of him. He moved closer, leaning slightly against the wall to catch more of the conversation, straining his ears. James's voice came again. "If he's going to be worth anything, he'll need proper training. He's rough, but he's got potential. I'm trusting you to make him ready." The unknown voice responded, this time louder with a hint of skepticism. "We'll see if the boy's got the grit for it. Streets of Arville is one thing, discipline is another." Alexander's pulse quickened. They were talking about him. Before he could process this, the hallway suddenly fell silent, and he realized his curiosity might have got him too close. He quickly straightened and tried to walk past, feigning a casual stride, but a firm voice called out, "Alexander." James's tone was unmistakable, and Alexander froze, feeling his cheeks flush. Turning, he saw James standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Come in here for a moment," James said, gesturing him inside. Heart pounding, Alexander entered the office, where he finally laid eyes on the man who had been speaking with James. Standing across the room was a tall, powerfully built figure with a weathered face and dark, intense eyes. His arms were crossed, and he wore a stern expression that seemed to take Alexander's measure with a single glance. "Alexander," James began, closing the door behind him, "I'd like you to meet Elias." As Alexander took in Elias's imposing figure, a wave of unease washed over him. Elias's sharp, assessing gaze and stern demeanor reminded him uncomfortably of Buster in a way he couldn't shake. He knew it wasn't fair. James had proven himself trustworthy, even kind, but trust didn't come easy after the life he led. His guard went up instinctively, a reflex honed over the years of betrayal and manipulation. Elias inclined his head, looking at Alexander as if he could see right through him. "I don't coddle, boy," he said, his tone hard and unyielding. "You might have survived the streets, but here you'll learn discipline. You'll follow my rules, or there'll be no place for you here." Alexander felt his fist clench instinctively, an old defense bubbling up inside him. Memories of Buster's scolding, his false kindness, his manipulation stirred unbidden. Elias's stern, uncompromising presence made those memories feel all too real, but he forced himself to nod, swallowing the defensive retort that rose to his lips. "Good," Elias said, his eyes flickering with something that might have been approval. "We start tomorrow at dawn. Be prepared." Elias turned and left without a second glance, leaving Alexander standing there, a confusing mix of emotions churning within him. As the door closed behind Elias, James placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Alexander," James said gently, "I know Elias can be tense, but he's someone I trust with my life. If you give him a chance, you'll see that he only pushes hard because he knows what's out there and what it takes to face it." Alexander tried to take comfort in James's words, but a lingering doubt gnawed at him. It was hard to believe in the world of trust and safety after years of watching his back. Even though he respected James, Elias was still a stranger, someone he hadn't known. His mind kept going back to Buster, to the times he had been told he was worthless without him, made to feel that loyalty was a chain he couldn't break. Could Elias be different? Could he really be trusted? Or was he just trading one manipulator for another? James gave a slight squeeze on the shoulder, a slight reminder that he wasn't alone anymore. You'll do fine, kid. You're stronger than you think. Alexander nodded, more to reassure James than himself, but as he left the office, a quiet voice inside reminded him to keep his guard up. Buster's voice, faint but lingering, whispered warnings he couldn't entirely ignore. Maybe Elias would prove himself. Or maybe he'd turn out like all the rest. Until then, Alexander resolved to stay vigilant, keeping a piece of himself protected, just in case. The sky was still a deep, dark blue, not yet touched by dawn, when a sudden rough shake dragged Alexander out of his sleep. He blinked, disoriented, his mind struggling to find itself in unfamiliar surroundings. But before he could fully awake, a hand gripped his shoulder firmly, yanking him upright. On your feet, Carpathian. Elias's voice snapped through the fog of sleep, sharp and unforgiving. Alexander's head swam as he struggled to focus, but the sight of Elias' unyielding expression jolted him fully awake. The man's face was set in a look of cold, almost calculated scrutiny, his eyes holding none of the kindness Alexander had glimpsed in James or Catherine. "You've got exactly 2 minutes to get dressed and outside," Elias barked, releasing his grip and stepping back, his gaze steady. "And if you're even 1 second late, you'll be running laps until you drop." Dazed but feeling an urgency of Elias' command, Alexander scrambled out of bed, fumbling to dress in a half-light. His mind raced, a mix of nerves and confusion swirling through him. He expected training, yes, but he hadn't anticipated the level of intensity. Still, he forced himself to move quickly, knowing that Elias wasn't the type to make idle threats. Barely a minute later, Alexander stumbled into the training yard, where the morning air was still cool and sharp, and the distant hum of the steam engines were the only sound breaking the silence. Elias was already there, arms crossed, his stance as rigid as his gaze was unyielding. He looked Alexander up and down, the slightest sneer pulling at the corner of his mouth. "You call that fast? Pathetic." Before Alexander could respond, Elias tossed a pair of metal weights towards him. They clanked heavily as they hit the ground, and he realized that they were steam-powered wrist and ankle bands designed to add resistance with every movement. He reached down to pick them up, surprised by their weight. "Strap them on," Elias ordered, his voice leaving no room for hesitation. "If you're going to train here, you'll learn what the real effort feels like." Alexander fastened the weights to his wrists and ankles, feeling the immediate drag of added weight. The cold metal pressed into his skin, the gears clicking into place with a mechanical hum as they locked on. His limbs felt sluggish, every movement now a strain. He looked at Elias, unsure of what was coming next. "On the ground, push-ups. 50, Elias said, his tone as unforgiving as his expression. "And if you stop, we'll go back to 0. Understood?" Alexander dropped to the ground, muscles already protesting under the added weight as he started his push-ups. But barely a few reps in, Elias' voice cut through a quiet as sharp as the blade. "Keep your back straight," he snapped, pacing around Alexander like a predator. "What do you think this is, some game? You think surviving the streets makes you tough? Out here, that means nothing. You're just a stray dog trying to look like a wolf." Each word stung, but Alexander forced himself to keep going. The weight bands pulling at his arms, his chest making every push-up feel like lifting lead. He clenched his jaw, trying to tune out Elias' taunts, to focus on the rhythm of his movements. But Elias wasn't finished. "Look at you, shaking already," he sneered. "This is the best you've got? You really think James took you in because he thought you were special? You're nothing but a pity project, a street rat that got lucky." Alexander's anger flared, his fist tightening against the dirt. He forced himself to bite back in a retort, knowing it would only make things worse, but the words burned inside him. He wasn't just some stray. He earned his way here, hadn't he? As he pushed himself through the last reps, his arms trembling with effort, Elias stepped in close with his voice low and cold. "Get used to this, Carpathian," he said with a mocking smirk on his face. "You think this was hard? This was nothing. This is what you'll face every day, and if you're not strong enough, then maybe it's time you ran back to Steamreach where you belong." With that, Elias turned and walked away, leaving Alexander alone in the dirt, his body battered, his spirit shaken. The weight of Elias's words settled on him, and slowly, painfully, he pushed himself to his feet, his mind racing with doubt. He thought he could belong here, that this was a chance to become something more, but now all he could feel was a lingering sense of defeat, a pull back to the familiar streets of Steamreach. And as he walked back through the estate, his steps heavy with exhaustion and uncertainty, a decision began to form in his mind. Maybe Elias was right. Maybe this wasn't where he belonged after all. The second morning came too soon. The sky still dark when Alexander felt a rough hand yank him upright. His entire body ached from the previous day's grueling workout, every muscle stiff and sore, and there was no time to resist. Before he could fully awake, Elias grabbed him by the arm and practically dragged him out of bed, pulling him into the cold morning air without a word. "Get up, street rat. You don't get to sleep in," Elias sneered, his tone dripping with contempt. "You thought yesterday was hard? Today I'm teaching you how to fight." Alexander stumbled, trying to keep up, but his limbs felt heavy, the previous day exhaustion still clinging to him like a weight. He barely had time to catch his breath before he reached the training yard, where Elias finally reached him, tossing him a wooden practice stick with a smirk. "Think you're tough, eh? Let's see what you've got," Elias taunted, his voice low and dangerous. He took his own stance, stick held loosely, almost casually, like he was preparing for a game rather than a fight. But the glint in his eyes was predatory, cold, as if he were a lion playing with its prey. Alexander clenched his jaw, a flicker of defiance igniting in his chest. He was tired, sore, but he wouldn't back down. If Elias wanted to fight, he'd give him one. Elias raised an eyebrow, the barest hint of amusement flashing across his face. "Go on, street rat. Show me what you've got." With a surge of frustration, Alexander lunged forward, swinging a practice stick with all the strength he could muster, but Elias sidestepped easily, barely moving, letting Alexander stumble past him before delivering a swift strike to the back of his legs. Alexander fell to his knees, gritting his teeth as pain shot through him. "Pathetic," Elias spat, circling him with a slow, deliberate steps. "You think flailing around like that makes you a fighter? You're no better than a scared little mouse thrashing in the dirt." Ignoring the pain, Alexander scrambled to his feet, anger simmering just beneath the surface. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus, then moved in with another attack. This time, he tried to anticipate Elias's movements, but once again, Elias was too fast, too fluid. He deflected Alexander's swing effortlessly, the counterattack landing squarely on Alexander's shoulder, sending him staggering back. "Is that all you've got?" Elias sneered, a mocking grin spreading across his face. "Come on, Carpathian, show me the famous street toughness, or are you just going to keep whining about how tired you are?" The taunt struck a nerve, and Alexander's anger flared. "Shut up!" he snapped, his words spilling out before he could stop himself. "You think this makes you strong, just pushing people around like some bully?" Elias's expression darkened, his grip on the stick tightening. "Mouthy, aren't you?" he growled. "Fine. Let's see how that mouth of yours holds up." In a blur of a movement, Elias closed the distance between them, his strikes coming faster and harder. Alexander struggled to keep up, barely managing to block a few hits before Elias' stick slammed into his side, his leg, his arm. Each blow calculated, precise, designed to hurt just enough to make him stumble, make him pay for every defiant word. Finally, one strike caught Alexander across the face, sending him sprawling into the dirt. Dazed, he looked up, his vision swimming, and for a brief, desperate moment, he caught sight of James standing on a balcony above, watching the scene below. A hope sparked in Alexander's chest, a fragile flicker. He met James's gaze, slightly begging for some kind of intervention, that he didn't have to keep enduring this. But instead, James's face remained unreadable, his gaze steady and distant. And then, without a word, James turned and walked away, disappearing from view. From above, Catherine joined James, her voice low but urgent. "He's just a boy, James." "He needs this," James replied, his voice firm but strained. "If I intervene now, he'll never trust himself." Catherine's gaze lingered on the training yard, her expression softening. "And if he gives up?" James exhaled sharply, a rare hint of vulnerability crossing his face. Then he was never ready. The hope that had briefly filled Alexander shattered, replaced by a hollow ache in his chest. He was alone in this. Whatever he thought James saw in him, whatever kindness or chance he thought he had been given, was gone. James had left him to face Elias's merciless training alone, and that hurt more than any blow Elias could deal. Elias saw the change of Alexander's expression and smirked, a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. He leaned down, his voice dropping to a low, mocking tone. "Go on. Look up there all you want, but nobody's coming for you, Carpathian. You're alone here, just like you've always been." He straightened, giving Alexander a final dismissive glance. "If you can't handle that, maybe it's time for you to find your way back to Steamreach." With that, Elias turned and walked away, leaving Alexander in the dirt, the weight of his words pressing down on him like a stone. As Alexander made his way back to his quarters, bruised and exhausted, the doubts clawed at him, louder than ever. He thought he could find a place here, thought he could make something of himself, but now all he could see was the empty balcony, the way James had walked away without a word. That night, as the shadows settled over the estate, Alexander made his decision. He wasn't going to keep enduring this, not if he didn't belong here. And if that meant returning to Steamreach, to the life he had left behind, so be it. Alexander slipped away from the McAllister estate, retracing his steps to the familiar streets of Steamreach. The dirty alleys, the rough-edged buildings, they felt like a Home, a reminder of the life he understood. As he walked, his thoughts churned, wrestling with everything that had happened. He didn't belong in the high city. He wasn't one of them, and he never would be. But as he wandered the darkened streets, a flash of light and a loud bang caught his attention. He turned to see a short, fiery-haired girl grinning as smoke drifted from a small stick of dynamite in her hand. Fiona? She looked over and grinned wider.
Well, if it isn't Alexander Carpathian, thought you got all fancy on us.
Alexander managed a weak smile. Just taking a break, he muttered, avoiding her eyes. Fiona studied him for a moment, her expression softening.
What happened, kid?
She asked, leaning against a crumbling wall. Alexander shrugged, trying to brush it off. They don't want me there. I don't belong in that world. Not really. They just see me as a street kid, someone to push around. Fiona's eyes narrowed as she folded her arms.
You're being an idiot, you know that?
Her voice was sharp, her frustration plain.
You got out, Alex. You made it to the high city. Do you have an idea how many of us would kill for that chance?
Alexander's shoulders tensed. It's not that simple, he protested. They don't respect me. I'm just some project to them.
So what?
Fiona snapped.
You think respect is handed out just because you made it there? You've got to earn it, Ally boy. Show them who you are, not by running away, but by facing whatever they throw at you.
She stepped closer, her voice softening.
You're better than this, kid. You know you are.
Her words cut through his doubts, forcing him to confront the truth he'd been avoiding. She was right. He had been given a rare chance, and here he was throwing it all away. He looked around at the grimy alley and crumbling buildings. This life had been all he had known, but now he had a chance to make something more of himself. He'd be a fool to waste it. After his conversation with Fiona, Alexander found himself standing at a crossroads in more ways than one. The familiar streets of Steamreach called to him, offering the comfort of life he knew well, while the path back to the McAllisters promised nothing but grueling tests and painful lessons. He walked aimlessly, Fiona's words echoing in his mind, battling with his own doubts and bruised pride. As night fell, Alexander found himself looking up towards the distant light of High City. His thoughts churning. Part of him wanted to prove them all wrong, to show Elias he was more than just a street kid. But another part of him felt the weight of everything he endured. A nagging voice that insisted that he didn't belong there, that he'd only be setting himself up for disappointment. The next morning, the training yard was silent, shrouded in the soft light of dawn. Elias stood alone, his stance rigid as he waited. His eyes narrowed as he glanced around, his patience beginning to wear thin. He expected Alexander to be there, whether out of pride, stubbornness, or anger. But the minutes ticked by, and the yard remained empty. On the balcony above, James stood in silence watching. His gaze was ready, but a hint of tension pulled in his features, as if he too was waiting to see if Alexander would show. He didn't speak, didn't move, merely observed with patience of someone who understood this was Alexander's choice to make. Elias's expression darkened as he finally let out a low sigh, a mix of disappointment and resignation crossing his face. He shook his head, muttering to himself, "Guess the street rat took the easy way out." He was just about to turn and leave when a sound cut through the stillness, a faint, hurried rhythm of footsteps approaching from beyond the gates. Elias paused, glancing toward the sound, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. Just as the first light broke over the horizon, Alexander came into view, running down the path toward the training yard. His clothes were rumpled from the night before, his expression marked with determination and a bit of defiance. But something was different about him, an intensity, a resolve that hadn't been there the previous morning. Breathless but unyielding, Alexander skipped to a halt in front of Elias. Standing tall despite the exhaustion in his limbs, he looked up, meeting Elias's gaze, with a fire that was unmistakable. Elias's mouth twisted into a small, approving smirk. "Back from the gutter you are," he drawled, his tone laced with mockery but carrying a hint of respect. "About time." Alexander didn't respond, didn't flinch under Elias's stare. He merely stood his ground, ready to face whatever was coming next. Elias glanced up at the balcony where James watched in silence. Their eyes met, a wordless exchange passing between them. For a moment, there was a shared understanding, an unspoken acknowledgement of what this moment meant, not just for Alexander, but for them all. As Alexander took his place in the training yard, the tension melted away, replaced by a sense of anticipation. He had chosen to return to face the challenges ahead, and though he didn't know what lay in store, he was ready to prove himself. Elias crossed his arms, his gaze steady, the hint of a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Let's begin, Carpathian. We've got a lot of work to do." As night fell over Eurocolydon, Councilor Hawthorne stood in his dimly lit study, leaning over a sprawling map of Eurocolydon. A faint glow of gas lamps illuminated the polished woods, casting long shadows across the room. His silver-tipped cane hovered over the marked trade routes, his expression tight with disdain. "Keegan Ironbear," he muttered, his voice clipped. "A blunt instrument with no grasp of subtlety. His reputation among the people is irrelevant. He's a minor setback, nothing more." The faint sound of gears turning and slight puffs of steam erupted as Buster Steamwell stepped forward from the shadows, his mechanical arm clinking softly as he adjusted its grip. Cigar smoldering between his fingers, he leaned against the table with a smug grin.
"Don't know the chap, but from what you're saying, sounds like he's not worth worrying about."
Hawthorne waved dismissively. "Precisely. A nuisance, but not a threat. Once unrest spreads through Steamreach in the Midway District, even his name won't mean anything. The Iron Guard will take over, and the people will see Victor for the incompetent figurehead he is." Buster exhaled a plume of smoke, his grin widening.
"Big words, Counselor. What's in it for me, eh?"
Hawthorne straightened, turning to Buster fully. "Control. While the Iron Guard scramble to restore order, your streets become yours. No interference, no oversight. Expand your reach, tighten your grip." Buster's grin grew sharper, his cigar bobbing between his teeth.
"Now you're speaking my tongue. But what about Victor? He's got enough soldiers to send my way if I overstep."
Hawthorne's lips curved into a cold smile. "Victor is predictable. He'll rely too heavily on brute force, overextending the Iron Guard when the chaos becomes too much and the Council will see his failure. They'll demand change, and I'll be ready." Buster chuckled darkly, but his grin faltered when Hawthorne tapped a finger on the map over the high city. "There's one complication, however," Hawthorne said smoothly. "James McAllister." The mention of the name shifted something in Buster's demeanor. His mechanical arm tightened around the cigar, the faint hiss of the joints filling the silence. His grin turned into a sneer, and his eyes gleamed with malice.
"McAllister.
Buster growled, his voice low and venomous.
That man doesn't know when to stay out of other people's business."
Hawthorne raised an eyebrow, intrigued by Buster's reaction. "You've crossed paths?" Buster didn't look at Hawthorne, his focus locked on the glowing ember of his cigar.
"Let's just say, he's interfered in things that didn't concern him. Took something he had no right in taking."
Hawthorne studied Buster carefully, his mind racing. "McAllister could be a problem," he admitted. "If he sides with Victor, he might stabilize the city. But if he can be turned," Buster caught him off with a low snarl.
"He won't turn. McAllister's too noble, too full of himself. Say the word, Counselor, and I'll take care of him permanently."
Hawthorne's eyes glinted with calculated interest. "Not yet. This plan will take some time. We need to lay the groundwork. Start building our crew, trusted men who won't flinch when time comes. When everything's in place, I'll let you know." Buster's grin returned, darker and more predatory.
"Fine by me. Gives me time to line up the right people. And when it's time to move, McAllister's mine."
The conversation was interrupted by a hesitant knock at the door. Hawthorne's gaze flicked towards the sound. "Enter!" he barked. A young aide stepped inside holding a black envelope sealed with an ornate wax emblem, a rose with jagged thorns encircled by a crescent moon. "This was delivered for you, sir," the aide said, his voice trembling slightly. Hawthorne snatched the envelope and dismissed the aide. The door closed. He broke the seal and unfolded the black parchment. His sharp eyes scanned the words, his expression darkening as he read. "Counselor, your ambition amuses us, but ambition without caution is a dangerous thing. Tread carefully, or your life may be forfeit." At the bottom of the letter, the same thorned rose emblem was stamped in deep red. Its intricate design seemed to pulse ominously in the flickering light. Buster tilted his head, watching Hawthorne carefully.
"What's it say?"
Hawthorne folded the letter slowly, slipping it into his coat pocket. His face betrayed nothing, but his voice was colder than before. "Nothing of importance. Just someone trying to bluff their way into relevance." Buster smirked, his curiosity unquenched.
"You sure? Seems like they struck a nerve."
Hawthorne ignored the remark, turning back to the map. He tapped his cane against Steamreach. "Start building your crew, Steamwell. When the time is right, I'll tell you where to strike." Buster's grin widened, his mechanical arm clicking softly as he flexed it.
"Don't worry, Counselor. When the time comes, I'll be ready. And McAllister, He's as good as dead.
Later alone in his study, Hawthorne retrieved the letter again, his eyes lingering on the sinister seal. For a moment, his hand hesitated, the weight of the warning pressing against his confidence. Then, with a sharp breath, he tossed the letter into the fire, watching as flames consumed it. "They'll regret crossing me," he muttered, his voice low and resolute. As the firelight flickered across the room, his gaze returned to the map. The unrest was brewing, and in his mind, every piece was already in motion. And now the plot thickens. Buster making a comeback with a personal vendetta against James McAllister, Hawthorne setting his sights for the head Primus position. And what about Alexander, with his training with Elias? And who's Fiona, this girl playing with dynamite that ran into Alex? How do they know each other? Well, a lot of these questions will be answered in the next episode, or the episodes to come. Thank you all so much again for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, I kindly ask that you leave a like and a comment down below. Whether it is a question or a statement, I do my best to answer everything on these videos. It helps boost the video in YouTube's algorithm for more people to see it, so I'd appreciate any interaction I can get on these videos. So be sure to be subscribed and also have that bell icon clicked so you can be notified when the next episode drops. Thank you all again so much for watching. I have been your host, The Count, and I want to wish you all a wonderful evening.